Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up, so let's get started right away. This is episode 11 of the podcast series where I talk about the project canvas. This canvas is a map of the project landscape, divided into 12 tiles. I've described it in the very first episode of this series. In this 11th episode, I'm going to talk about the project context. Have you ever worked in a diverse team with team members coming from quite different backgrounds? And have you been struggling with some obvious differences in communication, in attitude, in approach, and in modes of working together? Have you been running projects in different countries and experienced the frictions that come with working in international/multicultural environments? Or if you expect to be working in the future in such environments, then do keep listening and I will share some insights and some practical advice for you. Also, don't forget to visit projectdoctor.online to download the extras that come with every episode and also this one. So every project has its context. First, of course, the organization that starts the project, the type of organization and its culture. Then there is a societal context for the project, the public opinions and the debates in the media. And finally, there is maybe the history of the project itself and what that has done for the attitude and the feelings of the team members and the end users and the sponsors and third parties. So let's look at culture of the first aspect in the context. And the first topic I would like to cover here is Hofstede's cultural dimensions model. The Dutch management researcher Geert Hofstede has described 6 dimensions to help characterize cultures. I think it's a very interesting model, so I'll list these 6 dimensions for you. The first one he called the power distance index, which is a dichotomy with either accepting hierarchy and inequalities and power distance with respect for authority, or rather preponderance of decentralized decision-making and flat organization structures. The second dimension he called collectivism versus individualism, either more emphasis on personal goals and well-being or more emphasis on goals and well-being of the whole group. The third dimension he called uncertainty avoidance index. It's either a higher tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity and risk-taking, or more preference for strict rules and regulations and a low-risk appetite. The fourth dimension he called femininity versus masculinity. It's either more focus on strict gender roles and material achievements and wealth, or more gender fluidity and focus on nurturing and quality of life. The fifth dimension he called short-term versus long-term orientation. Either a more future-oriented and focus on persistence and perseverance and delaying short-term gratifications, or more emphasis on quick results and gratification and a respect for traditions. And the sixth and last dimension he called restraint versus indulgence. Either more acceptance of seeking to enjoy life and having fun, or more focus on suppressing needs and regulating them through social norms. Now, these dimensions are, of course, constructs. There's no place in anybody's mind or psyche where you can actually find them, but they're interesting in terms of highlighting and maybe even visualizing some differences when you cross borders from one culture to another or one country to another. These dimensions have been operationalized into questionnaires, which have then been used for surveys across the world, and they're being repeated every couple of years. And with that data, you can generate world maps that somehow visualize these aspects of cultural differences across the globe. I urge you to visit Project Doctor online and check out the link that I've provided on the extras page. You can there interactively compare countries and see how culturally different or similar you are from your fellow project managers in other countries, or from your clients and stakeholders for that matter, if they are from other countries or different countries. I think it's an exercise in cultural awareness. It's very helpful. As a practical example, if you recall, in episode 7 of this series, I've talked about the sponsor, and there I told you the story of my mishaps in a project in Belgium. Essentially, looking at that through the lenses of Hofstede's cultural dimensions model, my failing to manage the expectations was a matter of a culture clash. I was very much approaching problems the Dutch way, but that doesn't work out very well when you're in Belgium. More precisely, I think the issues had to do with power distance, a much higher value for that in Belgium, with masculinity, again a much higher value for that in Belgium, and uncertainty avoidance, again, not surprisingly, much higher value for that in Belgium as compared to the Dutch culture. Of course, I was aware before the project that the Belgians, although our neighbor country, are culturally very, very different. But surely I had underestimated the far and wide reach of these differences, and my own skills at that time in bridging the culture gap. I've learned a lot from that experience. Next to the model developed by Geert Hofstede, another one that's often cited as a way to characterize cultures is as either high context or low context in communication. In practice, of course, people or countries will be on a scale somewhere between these two extremes. Nevertheless, I think it's helpful in trying to recognize and understand how you, as a project manager, should expect communication to work, depending on whether you are in a high or a low context. In high context cultures, messages are implicit, indirect, and they require interpretation based on prior knowledge of the relationship and the situation. There's extensive use of non-verbal communication. There is less reliance on written communication because the knowledge is not written and your knowledge of the rules tends to be assumed. High context societies are defined by strong boundaries and a strong in-group mentality. And if you are an outsider, you're definitely an outsider. Business relationships will develop over time and tend to last long. There's a high value placed on accuracy and thoroughness, and there is a commingling of relationships and commitment/tasks/activities. In other words, the strength of a commitment is relative to the strength of the relationship. In summary, context is more valuable than actual words spoken in any communication. So you can see why this is called high context. In contrast, you will see in low context communication cultures that the messages are more explicit, direct, and understandable by both insiders and outsiders. There's limited use or more limited use of nonverbal communications, and written communication is commonly relied on, and contracts tend to be long and very detailed. Business relationships in this context are mainly of a practical nature, and they are quickly forged and they don't necessarily last very long. There's great value placed on speed, efficiency, and goal orientation, and there is a strong what is called compartmentalization between relationships, tasks, and activities. They do not mix. There is a time and a place for everything. To give you an example of how the difference between high context and low context communications might feel, a few years ago I spent several weeks in Singapore on the go-live of a major project. There were daily status meetings with business and IT representatives to follow up on the cutover activities. This was the second wave of a go-live, and a similar thing had happened a few months earlier in Paris. Now, France has a predominantly low-context mode of communication, though even from my Dutch perspective, I can definitely sense that they are a bit further on the scale towards high context than the Dutch are. There are even some jokes in France as to how blunt the Dutch can be. Anyway, in the status meetings, it was expected that a truthful assessment of the status and the issues would be given as either on track, recoverable delay, or at risk. And as far as I could judge, all the teams would faithfully report according to this guideline. In Singapore, however, discussions on progress and risks in the project were a bit different from how things were done in Paris. And the two things that were most visible to me: first, status was never reported as at risk, but usually as on track, or at most with a recoverable delay. And this happened even if in the subsequent discussions there were issues being talked about that would definitely warrant an at-risk status. I assume this was because reporting at risk would be a loss of status, a loss of face, and a breach to the business relationship with other stakeholders. The second thing I noticed was that there was a clear hesitation to give what I call binary replies, like no or yes. If members from the Asian team were pushed by European team members for such answers, I could sense their unease, and there would be promises to get back soon with a reply after some internal discussions that needed to take place. Now, to be sure, I am very much aware that I'm here describing this example in words that clearly are coming from a low-context culture. I'm certain that someone from the Singapore team would have given a different account of what had happened. I even wonder if this whole low-context, high-context way of describing cultural differences is itself maybe a low-context way of describing it. When talking about cultural dimensions, on a smaller scale, we can think of blue-collar versus white-collar environments. And this may relate to the end-user community, as the sponsor most often will be in the white-collar dimension. Or maybe this is just my bias. My practice of running projects is basically in capitalist economies, so I'm expecting that sponsors are in the white-collar corner. Might this be different in China, or Cuba, or Nepal, or Vietnam? I have no experience in running projects there. If you do, please let me know. It will be very interesting to hear your stories and learn from your insights, and who knows, maybe you would be a guest in a future episode. If a project has a big societal impact or a high societal visibility, then the public opinion or any media discussions are sure to be part of the context for that particular project. And this context can have a pretty big influence. As an example, and you'll probably have some from your own experience also to match this, when a new metro line was being constructed in Amsterdam, that of course was a very high impact and a very high visibility project from the start. It took almost 20 years to complete, and many events along the way made it into the newspaper headlines and the national television news. Especially several cases of major sagging and damage to houses. As a result of this context, serious project resources needed to be dedicated to working public opinion and providing transparency, and reporting to the various kinds of committees that were put in place to investigate all the issues. The final dimension I would like to mention is a structural difference between market-oriented and task-oriented organizations. And this structural difference leads to very pointed differences in the culture of these organizations. I've covered this particular topic in episode 2 of this series, where I've been talking about the project goal. Now let's wrap it up. What has been covered in this podcast episode? I've talked about Geert Hofstede's model of cultural dimensions. I've discussed the high context and the low context communication of cultures. And I've talked about the impact of societal discussions in projects with high visibility. With so many topics covered, I think you can do with some memory joggers. So please go to projectdoctor.online and download the extra materials that come with this episode. Also, the website where you can play around with Geert Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Subscribe and follow the podcast. And let me know your comments and reviews. I'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you. Bye-bye.